Jennifer Johnson is the owner of New Sky Coaching. She is a native Western New Yorker and a graduate of Canisius College.
University.
That's right. Oh, this is old. Oh, that's right. We got to change that word. She has spent over 20 years working with local health plans, focusing on the health and wellness needs of older adults in the community. So that's why she's here with us. Jennifer brings health and wellness programs to adults of all ages through live and virtual presentations at fitness centers, senior centers, employers, and community groups. In fact, today, the WebEx, so we're going to have how many people, Katie?
35 registered.
35 people at home watching us here today, too. Her passion for health, fitness, and cooking led her to coaching, where she can work intensively with people one-on-one and help them set and achieve goals toward sustainable change. Wow, who wrote this? Jennifer is a certified wellness practitioner, no, that's fine, certified personal trainer and registered yoga teacher. She lives in Hamburg with her husband, son, and 2 badly behaved kitty cats. Oh, what are their names?
Their names are Stefan and Jedediah.
Oh, Lord.
They were named after Saturday Night Live. Sorry. They were named after Saturday Night Live characters, which is a bit of a tradition in our house. Our previous cats were named after Saturday Night Live characters too. Stefan, yes. Yes. So for those of you who are familiar with that character, he is they call him Stefan the city correspondent. Our Stefan is the kitty correspondent. Yeah.
Well, let's welcome Jen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's been so long since I've come here and done a presentation like this. For those of you who knew me back in my health plan days, and I see some of you, I used to come here once a month and teach programs like this. So it's, but I haven't been here to do anything like this since pre-pandemic. So it's very exciting to be back here. And for those of you who have taken my BAM class before, when we have our obstacle course and you step over the extension cord, remember I told the story about the extension cord at the Aurora Senior Center? So always when I set up our little obstacle course at the end of class, I think about my yellow extension cord snaking through the dining room at the Aurora Senior Center. All right, so today we're going to be talking about brain health. And as it was mentioned, we all have a brain, right? Hopefully. We all have a brain, and it does change throughout our lives. So there's lots of different things that we can do to keep our brains healthy, to keep our brains active, and keep them in the best shape that we can for as long as we possibly can. Okay, thanks, Katie. So let's start out a little bit by talking about some of the changes our brain goes through as we move through life. So just like all the other parts of our bodies, our brains change, right? They don't stay the same as they were when we were born. When we're born, our brains are kind of moldable, right? So babies' brains change a great deal just in the earliest parts of our lives. So a newborn's brain is about 1/4 the size of an adult's, right? So we start just like all the other parts of our body. It starts out smaller and then ultimately grows to its adult size. The brain finishes growing in size by early adolescence, but that's like so much of us, that's size, not necessarily maturity. So if you think about the early adolescents in your life, their brains are the same size as an adult's, but those brains still have a lot of work to do to kind of put on those finishing touches before those adolescents move into full adulthood. The brain does not reach full maturity until our mid to late 20s. So think about the adolescents that you know, think about the young adults that you know in their early 20s. Don't they still make some horrible decisions sometimes, right? Their ability to plan and be logical, their ability to be patient, their ability to plan ahead, all of those things those come with that final maturing of the brain. So when we think about the difference between adolescents and adults, that's kind of those final finishing touches that get put on the brain in late adolescence and early adulthood. The normal aging process does bring about some subtle changes in cognitive abilities. So we will talk a little bit about normal aging-related changes to the brain versus changes to the brain that are not normal. And we're talking about things that happen to everybody versus things that we put firmly in the category of disease, okay? So things that are not a normal part of aging. But some studies do suggest that our brains start a very long, slow decline starting around age 30. 30! So as soon as the brain reaches full maturity, it starts going back downhill, okay? We reach our peak and then that's it. We start that long, slow, subtle slide. Can we go back just real quick? Sorry. And just to talk just real quickly about the difference here between the normal aging process versus the abnormal sort of process. Right now, the statistics show that about 1 in 3 seniors dies with some form of dementia, okay? But that's going to depend on a lot of different factors. It depends on age. The older we get, the more likely we are to develop some type of dementia. Just the further on we get in life, the more likely that is to happen. But there's so many other factors that go into it. And so that's why I do really want to spend, we will spend some time today talking about the difference between those normal changes, do we still call them senior moments? Those what we traditionally call senior moments, versus things that would be more categorized as a disease. If anybody's ever been to any of the seminars that the Alzheimer's Association puts on, and they're fantastic. I've worked with them for years. They do really, really great work. The presenters for the Alzheimer's Association always used to like to say, the difference between normal aging and dementia or Alzheimer's disease, with normal aging, sometimes you forget where you put your car keys. With dementia, you forget what the car keys are for. Okay? So that's a really kind of good way to think about it. Yes, we misplace things, we lose things, things kind of drop out of our brain for short periods of time, but usually if we retrace our steps, we can kind of figure them out. With those not normal types of aging, those changes that we see in the brain, that's a whole different scenario. Right? We're forgetting not just where we put things, we're forgetting how things work and what things do. So that's a totally different situation. Okay. So when we look at images of the brain, excuse me. When we look at images of the brain, we generally see something that looks like this, with the brain divided into 3 main parts. There's the cerebrum, which is the biggest part of the brain, the cerebellum, which is that kind of rounder part in the back, and then the brainstem, right? So the brainstem is kind of what we sometimes hear referred to as our reptilian brain. It's our earliest brain. It's the part that kind of controls all the bodily functions. And then the cerebellum and the cerebrum, we get a little bit more development as we go from the brainstem up to the cerebellum, up to the cerebrum. So 3 main parts of the brain. And though it only accounts for about 2% of our actual body weight, the brain is actually responsible for using 20% of the body's fuel. So the brain is so busy, so active, so metabolically active, doing so much, burning so many calories, that it actually requires about 20% of our calorie expenditure for the day. So the brain's got a lot going on. Even when we're sleeping, even when we're not doing anything, the brain is still doing its work. The brain's preferred source of energy is carbohydrates. Okay, so if you've ever done a low-carb diet and the first couple weeks you feel really groggy and crabby and grumpy, right? That's because your brain is literally saying, where is the glucose? I need the glucose to operate. So glucose is our brain's preferred form of food, of fuel. And we get glucose from foods that contain carbohydrates. If you have diabetes, right, you know about that relationship between carbohydrates and glucose. We need glucose for fuel for the brain. Now, can the brain operate on other types of fuel? Sure, right? That's part of how our bodies work. If we don't have access to glucose, the brain can operate on other things, but it really prefers glucose. And glucose is kind of it's like putting the wrong gas in your car, okay? It might still work, but it's not gonna work nearly as well as it would work if you were giving it the right fuel. So the brain is super metabolically active. It's got a lot going on. Excuse me, sorry, I got distracted for a second there. So these three main parts of our brain are what we usually see when we look at diagrams. Oh, there we go. But this is actually a fuller look at what the brain actually does and what it looks like. So we still have the brainstem down here, right, this orange piece, and the brainstem is responsible for all the big stuff. Okay? It's responsible for our reflexes, our breathing, our digestion, all of those things that we need to exist, those kind of basic bodily functions. The brainstem is responsible for those things. When we get up into the cerebellum, the little purple part there, once we get up into the cerebellum, that's where we have functions like coordination and balance and equilibrium. So damage to the cerebellum can be really impactful when it comes to how we move and how we are able to maintain our balance and our coordination in different situations. But then, once we get into the cerebrum, now we can take the cerebrum and break it down into various areas that each control certain specific functions in the body. So let's start in the back here. So we've got the occipital lobe, and that's where our vision comes in. So our visual perception, and then how our brain interprets what we're seeing. So not just actually what comes in through our eyes, our brain has to take those images and turn it into something we can understand. And so all of that happens in the occipital lobe, and that's also where reading, where all the functions of reading take place as well. And that makes sense, right? Because you're visually seeing words on the page, but your brain has to turn those letters, those marks, into something that makes sense, something where we can make sense of what we're actually seeing. When we get up top to the parietal lobe, here's where we've got our other senses, sense of touch, taste, smell, again with visual perception, some of that happens in here too. Spatial perception, which is our determination of where things go and how things fit together in space. Academic skills like math, again, reading comes into play here, writing as well. We're going to jump over here to the temporal lobe, so that's that aqua-colored portion of the brain. Understanding language, organization and sequencing, information retrieval. Does anybody else feel like their brain is organized like a filing cabinet? And when you are looking for a piece of information, you can kind of imagine a little person inside your brain flicking through all the files. Right? I think a lot of people feel that way. Some people feel like their brain is organized like a set of shelves, and they go and they retrieve the information from the particular set of shelves. So everybody's temporal lobe sort of organizes information a little bit differently. You don't really have a real little secretary person looking through the filing cabinet, but we each retrieve information differently. And so it's in the temporal lobe that's happening. We've also got things in there like musical awareness, musical skills, memory, hearing, learning, and feelings. And then finally, we get up to the frontal lobe. And the reason I left the frontal lobe for last is because we'll come back to our friends, the adolescents. Okay? The frontal lobe is the portion of the brain that finishes maturing last. And this is the part of the brain that controls things like judgment, inhibition, personality, language production, problem solving. All of these skills are located in the frontal lobe. And so these are some of the skills that we have trouble with until we're pretty far down the road into adulthood, right? This is why this slower development of the frontal lobe is what car rental companies always use as a reason to not rent cars to people under the age of 25. Because their problem solving, their judgment, their inhibition, all of those things are not quite fully developed yet. And so that's the part of our brain that develops last when we get into that early adulthood area. Okay. All right. So now that we've looked at sort of the structural makeup of the brain and where these different functions take place, what changes do we have in the brain as we go through life? There's 4 different kinds. They fall into 4 different categories. Structural changes, so those areas of the brain that we looked at have actual physical changes that take place. Due to those structural changes, then we have some cognitive changes. So changes in the way we think, in the way that the brain operates. Neuronal changes, so changes to the actual structures inside the brain. I'll show you a picture. And then finally, chemical changes. So we know that the brain relies heavily on hormones, right? Those chemical messengers that send messages throughout the body to tell us what's going on in different parts of the body, how we feel, how we react. So we have changes to those chemical processes that happen as we go through life as well. Okay, Katie. Sorry, I'm following along up here on my own computer so I can look at my notes. All right. So when we get into structural changes, as we enter midlife, our brains start to change. Not hugely, okay? If you looked at the brain of someone who was maybe in their mid-40s as opposed to in their mid-20s, it wouldn't look vastly different, but you'd start to see, especially if you were trained to do so, you'd see some subtle changes, okay? Not drastic. Brain volume begins to decrease. So literally the mass of our brain starts to decrease as we get into our 30s and 40s, and then we start to see that rate increase once we get into our 60s. The prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, and the hippocampus show the biggest losses, okay? So let's get into that a little bit. The prefrontal cortex is where we hold things like working memory. So working memory is your ability to hold a piece of information in your brain for a period of time while you manipulate it. So if anybody's ever asked you to do a mental arithmetic problem, and by the time you get to like the 2nd or 3rd step of the problem, you've forgotten what the numbers were, okay? That's working memory. So your ability to hold those numbers in your brain while you manipulate them. That's working memory. So we start to see a little bit of a decline in that, as well as multitasking abilities and sustained attention. So it gets a little bit harder to maintain our attention span for a long period of time as we see those, as we see the brain volume start to decrease in those specific areas of the brain. In addition, the hippocampus is where our long-term memory is located. And so those associated, those memory changes that we associate with getting older, those things are happening in the hippocampus. Those are all normal parts of aging. So we're still very firmly in the normal aging process here when we talk about these structural changes that happen in the brain. The cerebral cortex also thins as we age. So that's another part of the brain where we see some of those volume losses. But we tend to think of the brain as shrinking because it loses mass. But in this case, with the cerebral cortex, which is that sort of the outer part of the brain that we see that makes the brain look like a brain, that sort of lumpy stuff, that gets thinner as we get older. So it's not necessarily a matter of the brain getting smaller from like side to side or up and down, but the mass decreases because that cerebral cortex gets thinner as we get older. And then finally, researchers tend to use the phrase last in, first out to describe some of the structural changes that happen in the brain. And what that means is the areas of the brain that are last to mature are some of the areas of the brain that are first to start to show losses. So like that frontal lobe we looked at the end there a couple slides ago, that's the last to develop in teenagers and young adults. That's one of the areas of the brain where we start to see loss early on. So judgment, again, can sometimes be affected. Inhibition can sometimes be affected. Problem-solving skills. So last in, first out is how researchers and scientists sometimes refer to those structural changes. Okay, thanks, Katie. And then these structural changes lead to cognitive changes, right? So if we're seeing changes in the structures of the brain, that's going to affect how the brain works. So a lot of different things are happening here. Declarative and working memory decline. So we talked about working memory already, the ability to hold a piece of information in your brain while you manipulate it or work with it in some way. But also declarative memory. Declarative memory is sort of our autobiographical memory of our lives. So things you can, declarative, things you can say, things you can attest to, right? That sort of starts to decrease a little bit with age. And that's a normal part of age. So forgetting people's names, forgetting different experiences that you might have had in your life, or not necessarily remembering all the details of those events. That would be an example of that decline in declarative memory. Procedural memory, on the other hand, remains largely intact. And this is a big thing when it comes to trying to determine whether someone's mental changes are part of normal aging or due to some sort of disease process. Procedural memory is exactly what it sounds like. How to do something, right? So if you got on a bike at 10 years old, 20 years old, 40 years old, 70 years old, you're gonna know how to ride a bike, right? You might not be super comfortable doing it, but that's different from not knowing how to do it. If you got on a bike, you got on a stationary bike, you could ride a bike, okay? That's procedural memory. I remember how to do this. So as part of normal aging, procedural memory stays pretty intact. We remember how to ride a bike. We remember how to tie our shoes. We remember how to load the dishwasher. We remember how to do these things that we've done through our whole lives. When procedural memory starts to be affected, I get in the car, but I don't remember how to start it. That's different, okay? So when procedural memory starts to get affected, that can be a problem. That can be kind of an indicator that maybe something isn't operating the way it's supposed to be. Certain cognitive abilities actually improve in later life. So some studies have actually shown that some tests on verbal abilities, spatial reasoning, so again, the ability to kind of manipulate objects and know where things are around us, as well as math and abstract reasoning have been shown in some studies to actually improve with age. So not all is lost. And then finally, it's important to remember that our brains remain relatively plastic. So plastic is the term that researchers use. I don't really like the term plastic because plastic tends to be sort of hard and brittle. And what they're actually talking about when they say plastic is they mean malleable, right? The ability to create new pathways, to learn new bits of information, to connect existing bits of information in our brain. That's what researchers mean when they say plastic. And so what they mean is we're able to reroute neural connections to adapt to new tasks and challenges. If you think about the brain as a network of roads or highways, okay? Let's say, just to use the road example here, if you go out, you're headed to a particular destination, right? You get on that road and you find that, oh, there's an accident or there's construction or there's something happening that is going to make that not the best route for you to take, right? You could get off that road, take a back road, go around, reroute yourself, and still find a way to get to your destination. That's the same thing that our brains do, okay? So if we're trying to find a bit of information in our brains in the filing cabinet, okay, and we can't get there by the direct route, our brains will take a circular route to try to find that information. And if our brains can't quite find it, or if it's something new that we're trying to learn, our brains will build a new road, okay? Our ability to do that, we can do that through our whole lives. For a long time, researchers thought that this was something that we could do until about early adulthood. And then after that, our brains were kind of set. They didn't change a whole lot. We weren't able to build new pathways or build new roads. And now we found that's a bunch of nonsense. We can do that through our whole lives, and that's what's called neuroplasticity. It's our brain's ability to create new pathways between existing bits of information to make it easier to retrieve that information when we need it. So this is something we can do throughout our entire lives. And in a little bit, when we talk about some of the things that you can do to help keep your brain healthy, trying to build on that concept of neuroplasticity is huge. Okay. Thanks, Kate. Whoops, happened. All right. Has everybody seen this picture before? Wasn't it in your high school biology textbooks? Doesn't it? Everybody's seen this picture before. Neuronal changes. So changes at the level of individual neurons. So neurons are what builds those pathways. So changes at the level of individual neurons is what contributes to brain volume loss. So when we see a loss of those neurons, or we see a shrinkage in those neurons. So if we look over here, way up here at the top, so if you can't see it real well, what we're looking at here is a neuron and the different parts of a neuron, and way up at the top of the neuron are these little things that all look like branches sticking out from the end. And those are called dendrites. Well, those dendrites shrink as we get older. So they don't necessarily die off or fall off, they just get smaller. And it's that shrinkage of the dendrites, because they get smaller, contributes to brain volume loss. So if all of our millions and millions of neurons are all shrinking their dendrites, the brain is going to take up less space. Myelin, which is covers the nerve endings, myelin acts as a sort of insulator, and so that tends to deteriorate too as we get older. And the number of connections between brain cells drops. So here we're talking about those little back roads. So if we're thinking about that concept of a road system, those back roads tend to start to break down, right? Because just like anything else, if we don't use them enough, we tend to start to lose it, right? So just like our road, if it doesn't get used a lot, doesn't get driven on, the condition of it is going to deteriorate. And that happens in our brains as well. So if we're not using those connections, they do tend to break down, and so then we see the number of connections between those brain cells start to drop. So lots of different things happening at the level of individual neurons here too. Okay. And then finally, chemical changes. So our brains may also generate fewer chemical messengers. So hormones. Hormones are the way that our different body parts, the different sections of our bodies, communicate with each other, right? So when we say, oh, our stomach sends a message to our brain to tell it that we're full, well, how does it do that? It does it through hormones. Okay? Hormones are chemical messengers that travel through our bodies. Several studies have found that older brains synthesize less dopamine. Dopamine is one of our feel-good hormones, right? So those hormones that tell us that we're in a good mood, we're having a good day, we feel good. Older brains tend to create less dopamine, and there are fewer receptors to bind it. What does that mean? So not only does our body send these chemical messengers, the different parts of our bodies have to be able to receive those messengers. So it's not enough just to send it, something also has to receive it. There has to be a little base, a little station for those hormones to dock in. and those are called receptors. So not only do we produce less dopamine as we get older, there's fewer receptors, fewer docks for it to land in when it gets there. So we've got to have both the ability to send it and the ability to receive it, right? Like sending an email. You might send it, but if there's something wrong on my end with my email, I'm not going to get it. We've got to have both ends working. And so that is something that happens with those chemical messengers. One study, just one, found that older adults with what's called MCI, not the old phone company, had lower serotonin levels. So serotonin is another one of our feel-good hormones. MCI stands for mild cognitive impairment. So MCI is a diagnosis, and I do that because it's still kind of not totally understood. MCI is a diagnosis that's somewhere between normal aging changes in the brain and a diagnosis of something like dementia. Okay? There are changes beyond what we see in the normal aging process, but not quite enough to diagnose someone with dementia. I kind of compare it, and this isn't by no means a medical statement, but in my own brain, I compare it to something like prediabetes, okay? So it's not quite normal, but it's also not quite a diagnosable condition yet either. Sort of somewhere in the middle. So mild cognitive impairment is that stage in between. And so this study that found that older adults who have mild cognitive impairment have lower serotonin levels, now we're trying to find out, well, are those two things connected? If we could boost serotonin levels through some sort of medication, maybe something like an antidepressant that works on serotonin levels, could that reverse symptoms of mild cognitive impairment? So more to come on that. I think we'll find, I think we're gonna learn a lot of interesting stuff in the next decade or two with all the research that's being done into dementia like Alzheimer's disease and some of the changes that happen in our brains. Okay, thanks. That was all super depressing, right? And none of that is fun or interesting to learn about, but let's not be discouraged because there's a lot you can do to support your brain health. Just because those changes take place in the brain doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to have a massive impact on someone's life. There's lots of things that we can do to maintain brain health as we go through life, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. Okay. So there's 5 main factors that go into maintaining brain health. We're going to talk about each one of these individually. They're some of my favorite things in the world to talk about. We're going to talk about exercise and physical activity, sleep, diet, brain activity, and social activity. Before we even get into brain activity and social activity, I want to take a look at these 3 here. Exercise, sleep, and diet. Anybody ever come to any of my other wellness seminars or programs before? This is all we talk about. So today we're talking about brain health, and that's great. But we could just as easily be talking about how do you prevent falls? We could just as easily be talking about how do you prevent type 2 diabetes? How do you prevent cancer? How do you prevent any of these thousands of illnesses that we might get? Well, usually first by doing those 3 things. So today we happen to be talking about brain health. But the things we're going to talk about today are going to help not just with maintaining brain health, they're going to help with just health in general. Okay? So these are some of my favorite things to talk about because they make such a huge difference in lots of different areas of our lives. So exercise and physical activity. People who are physically active are less likely to experience a decline in their mental function. Why? Okay? Because when we exercise, exercise does thousands of good things in our bodies. Exercise, first of all, works on those chemical messengers. Exercise on its own creates or releases what are called the endorphins. The endorphins are one of those hormones, those chemical messengers, and the endorphins are the hormones that are our body's natural painkillers. So when we exercise, we're already getting a boost of those feel-good hormones. of things like serotonin and dopamine, those hormones that we were already talking about. Okay? So that's number one. People who exercise regularly also have lower rates of Alzheimer's and dementia. Why? We're not totally sure. But more and more we're starting to see a vague, blurry outline that maybe there's some connection between Alzheimer's disease and diabetes. It's real vague, it's real blurry, but it might be real. Okay? And it makes sense because the brain likes to use glucose for fuel. Well, glucose, we know, already has a connection to diabetes. And so there's something there. Some researchers are even starting to think that maybe we lump dementia in with the different types of diabetes. Maybe we call it type 3 diabetes, because once a person has Alzheimer's disease, the way their brain uses glucose is very, very different. Okay? Just like the way the body uses glucose when someone has type 2 diabetes is very, very different. So a lot more to come on this, but we know that exercise somehow is linked to lower rates of Alzheimer's and dementia, possibly because the body is using glucose for energy when we're exercising. Okay? Well, if there's less glucose in the body, then the brain has to do something else, right? Or we're using glucose in a way that's more efficient. And so the brain is somehow becoming more efficient with its use of glucose as well. So there's a lot happening there. Another thing we know about exercise is that it seems to reduce inflammation. And that we know correlates with improved cognition. So lower rates of inflammation in the body improve our thought processes, improve our brain function. And exercise also helps to build new brain connections. Okay? When we're exercising, our brain is sort of, how do I describe this? Our brain is kind of working on autopilot, right? You might be thinking about something while you're exercising, but also your body is doing a whole bunch of things without your brain having to think about it. And what that means is there's areas of your brain that are more active, and there's areas of your brain that are less active when we're exercising. When we're exercising, that gives our brain a chance to connect existing bits of information, to build those new roads. So, something that used to happen to me a lot when I was working a corporate job, I'd be sitting at my desk doing my thing, maybe working on a project, maybe struggling with something, and then during the middle of the day, I would get up and I'd go for a walk, or I'd go to the gym. We had a nice little gym in our office. Or I'd go out for a run. We were downtown. I like to run along the water, right? When I came back after that little break and that exercise, I usually had a whole new idea for a project I was working on, or a way to solve a problem that I hadn't thought of before. When we're exercising, our brain has the opportunity to add up existing bits of information to say, what would happen if I took this and put it over here? And maybe if I flip these things around. When we're exercising, our brain has the opportunity to build new pathways, build new roads. Okay. So what? So how much of it do we need? About 30 to 60 minutes on most days of the week. Okay. The guideline that's used is 150 minutes of moderate physical activity a week. So 150 minutes comes out to 30 minutes, 5 days a week. Okay? For some people, that might be really difficult. Okay? If you don't get a lot of exercise now, jumping into 30 minutes of activity at a time probably isn't going to work. Okay? What you want to do is start slowly and increase gradually, okay? Building up to that 30 to 60 minutes. Now, what if you already get that much? That's great. Okay? You should do more. We all should. Okay? Rarely do I encounter someone among my clients where I think they're doing enough exercise and they don't need to do any more. Almost everybody needs more. So A good rule of thumb is to get as much activity as you like. If you like to walk every single day, walk every single day. You don't have to limit it to 5 days a week. But when you feel like you need a break, take a break. Okay? It isn't going to do you any good to overdo exercise, although most of us aren't really in danger of that. It isn't going to do you any good to overdo exercise, but there is a danger in not getting enough. Okay? So we do want to try to shoot for that at least 30 minutes, if not closer to an hour, multiple days a week. Okay. Sleep. When we sleep, our brains are clearing abnormal material. So when we sleep, our brains are doing a little scan of what's going on in there. It's getting rid of unnecessary information. It's consolidating memory. So when we sleep, our brains are sifting through the millions and millions and millions of bits of sensory information that we took in all day long, all the things that we saw and thought and felt and experienced and touched and smelled and tasted, all those things. Our brain has to sift through all of that and decide what's important enough to go in the filing cabinet or on the shelf and what can be thrown away. All of that's happening while we're sleeping, in addition to millions and millions of other little tasks that our body does that we have no idea are happening. All of these things are important for brain health and for overall memory. Have you ever had an experience, maybe traveling, okay, maybe when you've had jet lag or something like that, you haven't been getting good sleep, maybe your clock is all messed up because you traveled and you jumped a whole bunch of time zones. In those situations, what happens is we tend to lose REM sleep. REM sleep is, REM stands for rapid eye movement, and it's the part of our sleep cycle where most of our dreaming takes place. When we're not able to do that, when we can't get enough REM sleep, we have a really difficult time concentrating, remembering things, being able to retrieve information, making decisions, and it's because REM sleep is the way that our bodies consolidate memory. Our dreaming, most researchers believe, is the way our brains take all of that sensory information that we experienced all day and decide what to keep and what to get rid of. So REM sleep is incredibly vital to our brain health and to our memory. How much of it do you need? 7 to 9 hours. Let's break that down a little bit more. Okay. 7 to 9 hours is what adults of all ages need for good health. Starting at age 18, okay, teenagers need more sleep. Starting at age 18, all the way through adulthood, 7 to 9 hours. Now I know for a lot of people, 7 to 9 hours is nearly impossible. Okay? Either you can't fall asleep at night, or you wake up too early in the morning, or you fall asleep just fine, you sleep for a couple of hours, then you get up, you're awake for a few hours, and then you go back to bed. All of those things are perfectly normal. There's lots of different factors that can impact how well we sleep. And a lot of researchers are starting to believe that we're not actually intended to sleep for 7 to 9 hours all in one big chunk. We're supposed to sleep in shorter periods throughout the night, 2 or 3 shorter chunks of time. If you can do that, that's great, all right? So if you're a person who goes to bed at 10 o'clock and you sleep for, 4 hours, and then you wake up, you're up for a couple hours, and then you go back to sleep, and you sleep for another 3 or 4 hours. As long as that works for you and your schedule and your life, don't worry about it. Do it, okay? Perfectly okay. And there are lots of researchers who are starting to think that that's the way we're actually intended to sleep. Now, if that doesn't work for you, well, then that's a problem, okay? So that's when we have to start looking into some things that might make it a little bit easier for you to get more sleep, and we could spend a whole hour just talking about sleep. Just a very few quick tips here, a couple of things. Incorporating a relaxing bedtime routine. If you have difficulty falling asleep at night, starting to unwind at least an hour before bed, turning off any devices, including TVs, cell phones, tablets, e-readers, anything like that. Yes, even if you want to read before bed, don't do it on your e-reader. Use a regular old paper book. Okay? The light that emanates from our screens interferes with our ability to sleep. Okay? Even though it doesn't look blue, the light that comes off of our screens is blue in terms of the waves. And that blue light tells our brains that it's time to be awake, right? Just like the sky is blue and the sun coming up in the morning tells our bodies that it's time to wake up, our body doesn't know the difference between the light from the sky and the light from our screens. It just recognizes blue light, and that blue light tells us it's time to be awake. So putting away those screens, putting away those devices before bedtime, and then incorporating some sort of consistent ritual. If you think about if you have kids, right? When your kids were little, what did you do at bedtime? You read a story, you brushed teeth, you put on pajamas, you sang a song, right? Maybe they took a bath, but you did the same thing every night because kids need a routine, right? Well, so do adults. But we get away from that once we're adults. We think we can just hop in bed and turn off the lights and we're going to go to sleep. But it doesn't work that way. Having a consistent bedtime routine trains our bodies and it trains our brains that, oh, these are the things that happen when I'm going to bed. So every night, if I take a hot shower and I drink a cup of herbal tea and I read my paper regular book for 20 minutes, or if I listen to some relaxing music, or I do a meditation, or whatever it is. But if I do this same routine every night, it trains our bodies and our brains that this is my preparation for sleep. A couple other things, talk about unplugging. Trying to make the room as dark as possible. At this time of year, it's not such a big deal because it's starting to get darker earlier. But if you live in a place where there's a bright street light out your window, or you have neighbors who leave their lights on at night, or whatever it is, any light can interfere with our ability to sleep. We're designed to be asleep when it's dark and awake when it's light outside. So trying to make your sleeping environment as dark as possible can make a big difference. So that might mean something like blackout curtains, or using an eye mask, something to make things a little bit darker. And then my first piece of advice that I always give anyone who's having trouble sleeping is to buy a new pillow. We tend to hold on to our pillows for a really long time, and that's kind of a quick, easy fix, right? It's not terribly expensive, and it might be just the change in sensation or the change in firmness of the new pillow might make a big difference in your ability to sleep. And like I said, we could talk for a whole hour just about sleep. Diet. So lots of studies show that a Mediterranean-style diet is best for brain health. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Mediterranean diet, it's designed based on traditional foods that researchers found back in the 1950s, studying men, it was all men at the time, studying men who lived on the island of Crete, off the coast of Greece. And they ate a lot of fish, right, because they lived on an island, but they also ate a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, they ate whole grains, they didn't eat a lot of sugar, they didn't have anything in the way of processed foods, both because it was the 1950s and also because Greece had really been ravaged by World War II and they were not recovering at the same rate as a lot of other nations, so they didn't have a lot of modern conveniences like processed foods. So they didn't eat any of that stuff. They ate very little meat, particularly red meat. When they did eat meat, it tended to be chicken, poultry, rather than beef or pork. They did eat some eggs, mostly fish, nuts for protein. And so the Mediterranean diet is designed similarly. It's intended to include more healthy fats, like olive oil, right, what we tend to think of when we think of the Mediterranean. So less in things like butter and animal fats. Very little meat, okay? If you think of the Mediterranean diet as a pyramid, at the very tip of the pyramid is where meat was, so it's the tiniest of the portions of what you might be eating. Fewer sweets. When they did eat sweets or desserts, their portions were very small. Cut out processed foods and drink mostly water and the occasional glass of wine. There's a really great article in an issue of Psychology Today. You can find it on their website. And it's the best diet to maintain your brain. And it talks about the Mediterranean style diet, but it's kind of an elevated Mediterranean diet. It's a really interesting study where they had the participants not only follow a Mediterranean style diet, but they also included a lot of wild greens in their diet. And they found that these greens really made a huge difference in their rates of heart disease and in their rates of brain decline as they age. So pretty interesting article. I don't know how many of us are going to go foraging for wild greens, but I would imagine that the domestic sort of greens are also reasonably healthful, and so including more green veggies in our diet is probably a good thing. And then brain activity. And so this is where you've heard about keeping your brain active, engaging in learning new things. And I like to think of it as thinking of your brain as a muscle. So it's not. Okay? The brain is not made up of muscle tissue, but pretend that it is in terms of what do we have to do with muscles in order to keep them healthy? They have to stay active, right? They need exercise. Well, so do our brains. So think of your brain as a muscle in terms of your brain needs activity every day. It needs to do work. It needs to learn new things and be exposed to new ideas and new activities so that it can build those new roads and new pathways. So when we learn new things, we build new pathways. Our brain is creating those new roads. So just a very few ideas. Learn a new language. Honestly, one of the best things you can do because it forces your brain to think in different ways. It forces your brain to have to retrieve information. What was that word again? Well, what does that sound like? Okay, well, that kind of looks like this word, right? It forces us to connect bits of existing information. It helps our brain to build new roads. What new language should you learn? It does not matter. It truly does not matter, okay? Spanish or French or Mandarin or German or what, it doesn't matter, but learning a new language. And honestly, the best advice that I can give you, the easiest way to do it, if you have a smartphone or you have a tablet, is downloading something like Duolingo. It's completely free. You can pick any language you want. There's a million of them. And it makes it so easy to learn, to learn a new language. You could also pick up something you've tried to learn before, or maybe something you did in school and then you got away from, because then not only are you learning something new, your brain is also going back and trying to dig in those dusty old filing cabinets for, oh, what was that word? I learned that once, right? Trying to go back and retrieve that information. So learning a new language is a great idea. Something like crossword puzzles. Crossword puzzles are great because the clues tend to be a little bit tricky, and so you sometimes have to think about not just the words in the clue, but the meaning of the words and the not just the dictionary definitions, but maybe the different ways that some of those words could be used. So crossword puzzles can be great. Something like Sudoku is good too. Doing jigsaw puzzles. So I mentioned several times about spatial abilities, right? The ability to figure out where things go and how different things interact in the world. Well, jigsaw puzzles are great for that, okay? Does this piece go here? Maybe it goes here. Maybe it goes down in the corner, right? I've got to look at the edges of the piece and figure out where these different pieces fit together. So jigsaw puzzles can be a good way to help give your brain a little boost. Some other options, build something, all right? Whether it's a model airplane, whether it's a piece of furniture, anything. But trying to put pieces together, again, is going to activate the areas of the brain that work with that spatial reasoning, as well as trying to follow directions, right? Reading the directions on a page and then trying to interpret what that means for this three-dimensional object that you're trying to build. And take a class, right? And that's why University Express is so fantastic, because you can take so many different classes on so many different topics. There's always something new to learn. But the key is to always be learning something new. Because when we're learning new things, we're building new roads, new pathways in the brain. Social activity. So we learned a lot about loneliness during the pandemic. And there was already some research being done into that area, but I think the pandemic really kind of gave research into loneliness a big boost. There is research that links loneliness to brain atrophy. So when we're interacting with other people, we have to follow conversations. We have to tune out other information in order to focus on what's going on in the situation that we're in. We have to be able to interpret what other people are saying. We have to be able to read faces and expressions and body language. And when we're not doing those things on a regular basis because we live alone or because we don't interact with a lot of people on a daily basis, we lose some of those skills. So interacting with people on a regular basis can help to give our brain a boost. We know that isolation can lead to depression and stress, and both of those things can impact our memory. So look for opportunities to connect with others. You're all here, obviously, so you're already doing these things. You're coming to events, you're traveling, you're engaging in social activities, but keep in mind the people around you who are maybe not doing those things, right? Your neighbors, your friends, family members, and how can you work with them to be able to maintain their brain health as well. And then finally, just a little honorable mention here. It wasn't on our list of the top 5 things you can do, but I always like to give it a mention about managing stress and anxiety. So stress really impacts our brain in addition to all the other parts of our body. But when we're experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety, our brains can't always work the way they're supposed to. They're impacted by those hormones that flood our body when we're experiencing stress or we're experiencing anxiety. So managing stress can be huge when it comes to brain health. Exercise and sleep both help with that. When we exercise, again, we're getting that flood of feel-good hormones, so that's important. And sleep is a way to help manage stress. When we're getting enough sleep, we're well rested, we're better able to handle the stresses that are coming the next day. We're able to recover from the stresses we experienced that day. So exercise and sleep are both great for helping to manage stress. In addition, you might try things like journaling, things like meditation or yoga. And of course, everyone knows that at some point, counseling or therapy is a good idea to help us manage stress and anxiety when we're struggling to manage it on our own. Enjoy your healthy brain. What kind of questions do you have for me? I'm just gonna go, if you don't mind putting up that last slide, Katie. This is just how you can find me. If you need to find me, you can shoot me an email or find me on a variety of the social medias. I do also teach, I teach a class here that we run in kind of short sessions, my balance and mobility class. So that is to help people reduce their risk of falls. So if that's something that's a concern for you, I've got a new class, 3-session class starting this week on Thursday. That's at 1 o'clock. So you could check with the office. I'm not sure if they're full up. And then I do teach several other classes around the community as well. I teach at some of the local libraries and some of the other senior centers.